So Wicked for Good is the sequel to last year's Wicked, which brings to a close the story of Glinda and Elphaba and whether or not their friendship will be able to survive the odd circumstances that they've been placed within, with Glinda being recognized as royalty and Elphaba being made out to be the evil witch that everyone in Oz should either fear or stop at all costs. Now, I really liked the first film just because I felt like it did have a good balance of kind of like the musical exuberance and the decadence of this fantasy setting, but still had a thematic core to it. Like, there was still a lot of interesting stuff in there, like, animals being persecuted, trying to rewrite history, authoritarians being in control, a friendship that becomes more complicated through politics, romance that becomes more complicated through politics. Lots of good stuff happened in that first film. And unfortunately, in the second film, it can't quite balance the theatrics with the thematics as much. Like, it really does feel like they're leaning more into just the music and the fantasy of it all, and not really like, exploring more of what you can do with this Oz setting and how you can make it feel more politically resonant. It feels like this film set up all these plot lines, and then, they've only got so much time left in this story that they have to wrap everything up as quickly as they can with a neat little bow. And if that means even just, plot lines petering out, or just or just like arriving at like an easy resolve, then so be it. That's what they're going to end up doing here. It definitely has that feel of a TV series that is coming to an end, and the creatives are not quite sure how to bring it to a close, and what they tend to do is just focus on what is the most important theme, and will just cut everything off and veer straight on that. And in this case, it is the friendship between Elphaba, with Cynthia Erivo returning the role, and Ariana Grande once more playing Glinda. The film is all about their friendship, but unfortunately, it doesn't really spend as much time with them. And the problem with the film is that it wants to do so much with this material, not just with like the friendship between Elphaba and Glinda, but also with the love triangle between them, with Fiyero, played by Jonathan Bailey, which I thought was compelling, but we don't spend enough time with him to see Fiyero's conflicting nature about serving in the Guard with Oz and being more dedicated to Elphaba. It felt like there should be more conflict with him, but there isn't as much of that here. And it feels like very weird how the film will just kind of lean into the theatrics of it. Like when we first see Glinda, she's in this royal role and she's just accepting it. She's once more, this popular figure who's in like a higher role in society, and she's just playing it up with all the glam and the musical numbers. And you're just like, oh, she's, it's got that cute look to her, and she's got that glitzy, glamorous style to her. And the film just kind of like drinks her in for a bit, but I'm like, shouldn't she be a little bit conflicted about Elphaba? And you're kind of just watching her slowly come to the realization that, yeah, Oz is corrupt, even though it's kind of obvious from the beginning here. But I think the problem is like the film gets so lost in just like all the decadence and the musical numbers that often forgets about it. At one point, there's a scene where Glinda and Elphaba both try to strike a deal with Oz, and they just get lost in this music and dance number, which feels wildly off in how it's assembled here. Like, I never quite got the idea that Oz is that much of a charmer that Elphaba and Glinda could easily just kind of, go along with like the song and dance number here. I think you gotta work a little bit harder to understand why the characters would be a little bit more dazzled by this. Like, don't get me wrong, there's some fairly good set pieces. In fact, the sequence with Oz, once more played by Jeff Goldblum, I thought that was a really neat sequence, but thematically, you're just asking yourself, wait a minute, it doesn't Elphaba consider Oz the enemy here? And why is she just kind of going along with the musical number? It almost feels like she just had to kind of go with the flow instead of being more rebellious. But the film just doesn't have time for it. And it's weird because like it's almost like 2.5 hours, and it feels like this film wants to do everything and ends up doing nothing. Because there's still that subplot of animals being persecuted and forced into slavery. So there very much is like an immigration angle there with how the animals want to depart Oz because they don't feel safe there anymore, which interesting angle, but doesn't really go much further than that, other than just, showing the animals leaving. Elphaba is still conflicted about her powers. In many cases, she's trying to use them to try to right the wrongs and ends up screwing them up. And I felt like there should be more time for that. There also should be more time for the romance that she has with Fiyero, which it feels so inexplicable. Like it arrives at this moment where there's this romantic duet between the two of them, as they're just about ready to get into bed and have like a love scene together. And it just, I kept thinking during the scene, it's like, okay, this is a decent number, but it's rushed so much that it's just like, even like, I get the feeling like, shouldn't like Fiyero almost be like, I don't know, I think we're kind of moving pretty fast here, but that's the entire film at this point. Everything is moving so fast that there's not a moment to just like to drink in the world of Oz and frame a better allegory, as opposed to just finding ways to either resolve the plot lines or just cut them off cold. In particular, I was very stunned that they really did cut off the relationship between Bach and Nessa. Bach, once more played by Ethan Slater, and Nessa, played by Marissa Bode. That they do have like an interesting dynamic where like they show how a corruption of power can complicate that relationship, and you can't force someone to love you. But it just kind of feels like broad strokes with them, and it never, like, there's a lot to explore with that relationship, and it never quite feels there. And it also, like, especially when Elphaba's thrown into the mix, it just kind of reveals this big problem of how they have to maintain the status quo of adding Dorothy into the mix. Because once Dorothy is in the story, well, she doesn't really dominate the story, but she's always in the background, and it feels like everything has to center around her after that point, that it feels like every other relationship and conflict and political development just gets sidelined so that everything can line up perfectly here, and try to find like a resolve for for how we got the Tin Man, how we got the Scarecrow, how Oz and how the great and powerful Oz ended up leaving his land. It's like all these explanations for questions I do not care about in the original Wizard of Oz. Not to mention, I wish this film took more risks, because think about this for a minute. This film is based on a musical, which is a revision of a novel, which is also a revision of a novel. But, if you're having revisions of revisions of revisions, why not experiment more? Why not do something radically different with this material? Because the way that it proceeds here, I've heard from a lot of people say this, that, yeah, this is pretty much the same way that the stage production ends. And it's like, yeah, that's very dissatisfying, though. And it's like, couldn't someone like look at it at that point just like, well, this doesn't feel like it's working, could we change this up? I mean, yeah, would fans be disappointed? Probably, but it would still be it would still give them something to talk about, instead of just being like, oh yeah, that's how the stage production goes. Because it's very unsatisfying here, and there's so much wasted potential with this. Like, consider this. Okay, so they do have talking animals in the film, and they do show one of the winged monkeys. I think his name is Chistery, I think, and he's voiced by D. Bradley Baker. Now, D. Bradley Baker, he does a lot of cartoon voices. He's done tons of roles. He's kind of like a Billy West or DiMaggio. He does tons of voices, so it makes sense that you just bring in a standard voice actor who could do a talking animal. But then, for the Cowardly Lion here, they have him voiced by Coleman Domingo, and he doesn't really have much of any scenes, and they don't really play up this character in a way that makes you care about it. It's like, you have Coleman Domingo in this film, and you're wasting him on just a handful of lines. It feels like such a waste. It felt like there was an opportunity to do something very revolutionary with this material here and switch it up, instead of just sticking to the status quo of both like the musical and Wizard of Oz at the same time. And it just comes off very, very unfulfilling the way that it's framed here. Now, to the film's credit, director John M. Chu, he does have some decent sequences here. I like some of the choreography. In particular, I did like a sequence where Glinda is contemplating her decisions in song as she ambles around her kind of like palace quarters. And there's a great use of like, reflections of like pulling in and pulling out and distorting your perspective here and there. I thought that was a pretty nice sequence. But it's a nice sequence if you divorce it from the fact that Glinda is only slowly starting to see beyond all like the fashion and the fame and just the power that she holds to realize that, yeah, she's actually hurting her friend and isn't doing enough. In the same way that I don't think the film is doing enough. I don't feel like it's playing off the material that well here. I feel like everything is just kind of trying to neatly align itself so that it perfectly syncs up with The Wizard of Oz, which, like, who cares? Because I didn't care about, like, the status quo. We don't really spend that much time with Dorothy. We don't really care about how this would line up as a side story. The first film did very much feel like a prequel that was trying to toy around with some stuff, while the sequel film, For Good, feels like it's very much a side story, and strictly sticking to a side story, to the point where there's this very off tone to everything. Like, Nessa at one point is used as, as an establishment of like the red shoes that Dorothy will get, and the way that it proceeds, especially with like Elphaba, grappling with a death in the family, it feels wildly inappropriate that it goes from that sequence to this very silly scene where Glinda and Elphaba are fighting each other, and it's meant to be like comical and has like some levity to it, but it's levity right after death and grief was right there, and then just kind of, and just inexplicably, Glinda just sticks to the script here. And it feels like Elphaba should be more angry and not just playing up the role that she's given here. At one point she just does the witch cackle for no other reason other than the fact that just, yeah, that's the role that she's accepted. I'm also really not a big fan of the way that the film ends with trying to, basically the ending leads more towards utilitarianism. We're realizing that, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So, we got to be devoted to the people of Oz and sacrifice herself. It left a bitter taste in my mouth that the film had to end on that note of realizing that, that you have to work within the system, even though the system here is pretty damn rotten. That the way that Glinda kind of like finds like the perfect way to kind of like stick to, basically she gets to have her cake and eat it too. Whereas Elphaba has to kind of like go more off grid as the film ends here and kind of like stay there and realize that she is a little bit too dangerous instead of like sticking around to be more of herself. It was so dissatisfying the way that the film ended there. Not to mention, even on like a theatrical level, there are no, aside from like Oz's little menagerie of weird inventions and everything like that, there wasn't a set that I really gravitated towards in this film. Like in the first film, I really liked the design of the little library they had at the academy. I thought that was really cool design. I like how it played off with the dance choreography. There wasn't a scene like that for me in this film. There wasn't even a catchy song, and I think for a lot of people, that is going to be like a big deal breaker here, is that the songs are really not that good here. That they're sung fairly well by both like Arrivo and Grande, but there's no earworms here. There's nothing that I'm gonna be humming along as like I leave the theater or think about like a month from now. It evaporated so quickly, and just for the fact that I wasn't really on board with where this story was going the more that it went, it became so much harder to be engaged with the film as it just kept going along, and just like it had these like good but not great musical numbers and some decent set pieces and some mild levity here and there that I thought was okay, but politically and thematically it's such a mess with how it just like lets certain plot lines peter out and then just kind of easily resolves all these conflicts on this very dissatisfying level. So yeah, Wicked for Good is in very stark contrast to the first film. Like, I enjoyed the first film because it felt like it had a good story and some good theatrics to it, but Wicked for Good, it has the theatrics mostly, but good story, it's not really there.